Okay, so let's dive in to pregnancy, growth, and development. I'm excited because Mrs. Serrano is going to be spending some time with us as we go through some of the lecture pieces. When we talk about pregnancy and childbirth, I have secondhand experience. She has firsthand experience. So she's agreed to share some of that with you, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about myself. So let's dive in. We're speaking particularly about how the baby is growing, right? We're talking about the process of development. So going from just these single one-celled sperm and egg meeting to becoming a fully functional, completely autonomous baby as it's born. And they kind of divide things into this prenatal and postnatal. Prenatal being from fertilization to birth, and then postnatal being from birth to death. It's kind of huge categories, but okay. We're spending most of our time in this unit talking about the prenatal period. So the pregnancy, of course, is developing this offspring in the uterus, which comes from fertilization. The egg, the sperm, meeting. Let's talk about that in more detail. So, the sperm cells usually have to get all the way up to the upper third of the uterine tube. That's normally where fertilization takes place, very high up in that uterine tube. So it's a long journey. You know, if you were to scale the journey these guys are making, it's on the course of miles in length. Do you understand what I mean by scale? The scale of the sperm, right, to the length it actually goes versus the scale of you and I to a distance we have to travel. We're talking about miles worth of time that these guys have to travel. And it's not like it's this nice, inviting, warm, comforting environment they're running in or traveling in, right? It's basically an environment designed to kill any outside organism that gets in. You with me? So they have these protections already built in. That whole seminal fluid is designed to help protect the sperm from the environment of the vagina and the uterus, and to give it strength, to have the glucose present to make that huge long journey. Does that make sense? So the uterus actually does make things a little bit easier for the sperm. The fluids, the secretions of the uterus and the vagina are actually thinner in the first part before ovulation and up to ovulation to allow these sperm to be able to travel easier. As progesterone increases, things get thicker and makes it a little more difficult for them to move. So how does that fertilization occur? I got a couple of slides here that will talk about this. You remember the sperm on the very end of it, on the head of the sperm, what's present there? The acrosome. And what is in that acrosome? The enzymes. And what are those enzymes doing? Yeah, it literally eats away this outer layer of the oocyte, of the egg, to allow the sperm to get in there. So those two areas are called the corona radiata and the zona pellucida. These guys on the outside here, corona radiata, looks like a sun, right? Like that's what it's good, the radiating corona. And then this zona pellucida is this inside area before you actually get into the cell. It's like the covering, like the protective coating on the outside. So these guys have traveled all this way, and yet still they have to burrow their way in to get into the promised land. You with me? And once that penetration occurs, once one sperm cell gets in, there's a shift in the chemistry in that zona pellucida, in that cellular membrane of the oocyte, and it basically stops any other sperm from getting in. In the images piece, you get, and this is in your textbook as well, this picture that's showing that it's not, yeah, that's there on page 551. It's not just one little sperm that makes it up there. I mean, it's like swarmed with these sperm. Because again, that's their whole goal, is to try and get that, to be the first. And I know I said this before, but it always makes me chuckle a little bit, but makes me feel good. You are a winner. I am a winner, right? The sperm that made you Yes, even you are a winner. It's cool. I like that. All right, so we keep going. The fusion of that egg and sperm, that is what makes fertilization. That's what we're talking about when we say something, an egg and sperm have been fertilized. And when we have this fertilization occur, you get what we call a zygote. Now, you are going to see that this little ball of cells, right, that once was an egg and a sperm and they have now come together to make this zygote, they're going to call it about 10 different things before we're done, before it actually comes out as a baby. Are we cool? And it all depends on how developed it is, what it looks like, whether it's implanted or not yet, how it's implanted. So don't get fooled with all these different names. Don't worry too much about all the different names. I want to make sure you understand they're all talking about this ball of cells that becomes this baby. Though it also becomes much more than just the baby, and you'll see that as we go through. Any questions there about this fertilization process? Because again, that is one of the pieces on your study guide that you should be able to describe this sequence of events of what's happening in fertilization. Okay, so we'll dive into this early embryonic period. You can see that on your study guide that you have this embryonic stage and you have the fetal stage. This is down below, just before it says placental membrane. And we're talking about the early embryonic stage. So what's happening there? Well, this cell, this egg and sperm together, which we make a zygote, starts going through this process, what we call cleavage. What does it mean to cleave something? Does anybody know? It's an old-fashioned word. Yeah, cleaver, right? Yeah, it's cutting, it's separating. So this cell doesn't change in size, but it starts splitting itself into more. One cell becomes 2, 2 become 4, 4 become 8, but it doesn't change sizes. Does that make sense? It's not getting bigger, it's just literally splitting itself into these multiple different pieces, okay? And this dividing mass of cells, which we now call a morula, it's not a zygote anymore, it moves down the uterine tube toward the uterus, where as it becomes a blastocyte, again, here are all the different names, right? All the same, we're talking about the same piece. This blastocyte implants into the lining of the uterus. And this offspring, during this first 8 weeks, we call it an embryo. Once it's implanted, and it's beginning this developmental process, we call it an embryo for those first 8 weeks. And then, after that, called the fetus. So that's where we get these two stages, right? The embryonic, the embryo stage, and the fetal stage, the fetus. Are you with me? And some of the cells of that blastocyst, so that blastocyte we're talking about, it's both an outside covering and the baby itself. That's what becomes the placenta and has hormones it secretes. We'll talk much more about that. So here's your picture, and this is in your textbook. That's there on page 554. That kind of runs you through the process. So this has already been fertilized, right? The egg has already been fertilized, and I know that because there's two nuclei, right? The sperm and the egg. And these guys are going to meet together, right? And then they're going to start making that cleavage. The 1 splitting into 2, the 2 splitting into 4, the 4 splitting into 8, etc., right? And as it's moving its way down toward the uterus, that's when it's undergoing this process of cleavage and splitting. Are we cool? Once it comes here, and again, we're talking about day 3 or 4 is when they would call it this morula. It no longer really looks like a one-celled something. It's getting bigger now. The cleavage process has happened quite a bit. And as it gets ready to implant, that's where we call it this blastocyte, where it's starting to, it'll literally grow roots. And I'm making, I guess not actually roots, but that's what it looks like, from that cell down into the uterus in order to implant. Does that make sense? Any questions there? All right, so what's happening hormonally? to these ladies during pregnancy? Well, the outer layers of cells, which again is called the trophoblast, of that blastocyst stage, it secretes this hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG. And what that does is it keeps the corpus luteum present. Now, remind me again, what's the corpus luteum? The very last bit of that follicle, right? Remember the egg grew in the follicular stage, and then it burst out in ovulation, and that follicle stays put, right, in the ovary, and it goes through this process of kind of decaying. It's not really, it's just shrinking to become this corpus albicans, and then finally this corpus luteum, right? My apologies. Thank you. The other way around. And the point is, this HCG keeps that follicle there. It doesn't let it completely, totally decay away and stop producing hormones, right? So therefore, why? Why would that be important? Because the buildup of these progesterone, because that's what these guys are producing, right? Progesterone, what is it doing to the uterus? Go ahead. Okay, so it gets thicker, right? Sure, there's more blood vessels there, there's more tissue there. Okay, and then when that progesterone stops being produced, what happens to that layer? It sheds, it goes away, right? That's what a period is. So why would it be important to keep that layer present? Because the egg is actually implanting there. Does that make sense? So to me, it's always helpful. There's so many different hormones and different pieces. I don't want you just to memorize it, but if you understand the why, it makes sense. We want to keep that corpus luteum around so that therefore it keeps producing progesterone. So we can keep that layer of the uterus intact. And the levels of HCG remain high until the placenta is there and mature enough to start producing its own hormones. So here's what we're speaking about. That blastocyst, the outside here, right? And in the inside, that's the mass of cells that's actually going to become the baby, right? And that blastocyst starts sending out these little roots, these little trophoblasts down into the uterus to basically plant itself there. And then once the placenta is mature enough, this outside layer, it starts also secreting what we call placental lactogen. What is lacto? What does that sound like to you? Milk, right? Yeah, lactose, right? So this is what's going to help increase breast development and get these parts of the breast ready to produce the milk so the baby can be fed, right? And other hormonal changes include increasing the amount of aldosterone that's present, so the lady is holding on to fluid more. Some ladies will talk about their feet swelling and their hands swelling during pregnancy. Again, because you're trying to keep this fluid present because you're trying to keep enough fluid for both you and the baby, right? And then also parathyroid hormone, which you remember controls the amount of calcium in the blood. And obviously we need more of that present so the baby can use it to make its bones. Does that make sense, my friends? Any questions there? And again, on your study guide, there are some pieces there. Relaxin is another hormone that I put in there. I'm not even sure that's in your textbook at all. Relaxin is a hormone that plays quite a cool role, I think. So, pelvis, right? We cool? Remember that the pelvis is not one whole thing, right? It's two separate pieces that are held together by this pubic symphysis in the front and then by the wedge of the sacrum in the back. And there are ligaments, right, that hold these three places, these three areas of contact together. What relaxin does is it allows those ligaments to relax. Again, anatomists are not creative. What it does, we name it. Sometimes in Latin, but otherwise, we just name what it does. So it's allowing those ligaments to relax and stretch. And what that does, because remember that that head of that baby has got to go down through this hole and out the front, right? And so we want to give more space to allow this to happen. It's one of the ways that archaeologists determine whether that skull is a male or a female. They look at the hips. If the hips are wider and a little more tilted backward like this, it's probably a female skeleton. Because guys, our pelvises never do that. Does that make sense? And they found this same hormone in whales, in a number of different animals, that allows these to give live birth. It's just kind of a cool little piece with that. Make sense? Are you comfortable that could give you some back pain? Right? That can cause some problems? Right? Obviously, you've got this huge amount of weight, and we'll talk more about the whole positioning of what that does to you, but that can be an issue. Mm-hmm. It can be a source of pain, yeah, or things not working right. As a physical therapist, there are things that we can do, there are manipulation pieces we can do to move those guys around. Different, we call them muscle energy techniques, where you're pushing or pulling or moving muscles in certain ways that can help rotate those guys. It all depends on the person. In other words, we could go around right now in this room, and probably 40% of you would not be perfectly aligned and perfectly everything all the same, but maybe only 10% of you have any pain because of that. So it doesn't mean, this is the tough thing with all the imaging we can do, just because something is not perfect doesn't mean that's causing the problem. Does that make sense? But no, there's a whole, my sister-in-law does women's health as a PT, and she spends a decent amount of time working on the muscles and the alignment of the pelvis to help keep things well. So yeah, it's a good question. Okay, let's talk about this embryonic stage a little bit more. We were doing the very early embryonic, now we're moving into more the meat of the embryonic stage. Again, 2nd week to 8th week. And during this time, all of the major internal organs are being developed. All the major external features, again, a face, an arms, legs, a body, these things start to happen. You start to actually get something that looks like a baby. During the 2nd week, the embryo is now called a gastrula. Again, all the different pieces, right? And its inner cell mass transforms into the embryonic disc, and layers form within it. So let's talk about these germ layers. And sorry, I keep coming back to you. I appreciate you having it ready for me. Keep going one more. Yes, thank you. Page 558 is where you see the pictures for these germ layers. It looks like this, but when I go through the discussion pieces first. But before I do that, my apologies. I'm going to go back to the images. And we were talking about those hormones, and this is in your textbook, right? This kind of chart graph showing you the different levels of hormones being present. Just using your reasoning, which of these hormones do you think would make a good pregnancy test hormone? HCG, right? Why? Because it's not really present at all in that first month or so, right? And then suddenly, huge spike, right? And it's not something that you all normally have, ladies, in your bloodstream, right? Does that make sense? So therefore, if I created a urine test that could very easily detect this hormone, and if you checked your urine and sure enough that hormone was present, what could you assume? That you're probably pregnant. Yeah, it is. It is. Okay, so I want to get back to that. All right, let's continue on with these germ layers. So, 3 main pieces. And again, these layers give rise to all the different organ systems. So the first one's called the ectoderm. The ectoderm here, that's this right here, right? The ectoderm gives rise to the nervous system, some of the special sensory organs. So we're talking about the ears and the nose and the eyes. The epidermis and the epidermal derivatives, things that come from the epidermis, right? And the linings of the mouth and the anal canal. So we're talking about the outside layer, basically. We cool? Along with the nervous system. Thankfully, because the nervous system wants to be connected to those outside layers, right? The next set is the mesoderm. Meso, of course, means middle. So we have ecto, which is outer, meso, which is middle, and endo, which is inner. Make sense? The mesoderm, they form all the types of blood tissue, muscle tissue, bone marrow, blood and lymphatic vesicles, internal reproductive organs, kidneys, epithelial linings of the body cavities. So this is a lot of the inside kind of pieces. We cool? Or kind of that middle layer. And then last you have the endodermal cells. So mesodermal being here, endodermal being there. And those endodermal cells produce the epithelial linings of the digestive tract, the respiratory tract, the urinary bladder, the urethra. So digestive-y kind of, digestive urinary pieces. That would be the endoderm. Are you with me, my friends? And again, I do want you to be comfortable with what these different germ layers, the structures that they are providing. You have these chorionic villi that are sent out. What the chorionic villi are basically acting like the placenta to get oxygen and nutrients from the mother and bring it into this baby's cells. The placenta and the placental vessels do the same thing as it continues to grow, but that's the early stage of that. By the 4th week, did you realize this? So, the egg and the sperm have met, right? And they start immediately growing, right? Implantation occurs about a week later, 5-6 days after the fertilization occurs, right? At the 4th week, so we're talking about maybe 3 weeks later, you may not even have realized you've missed your period at this point, right? Depending on how regular things are. The heart's already starting to beat. Those tissues are actually, you can see the rhythm of the beating that's happening. Is that a human being at that point? Again, this is one of those tough questions. Where do you draw that line? Where do you make that mark of, yes, this is a human, or no, that's not a human? You with me? The head, the jaw, the limb buds, these little pieces that actually look like arms and legs start coming. Some other pieces, by the 8th week now, 2 months in, the trophoblast, the outside layer, is now what we call the chorion. And a piece of that is what develops into the placenta. Another membrane called the amnion is developing around the embryo, and that's what will hold this cushioning amniotic fluid. The fluid that surrounds the baby in the placenta comes from this. And it basically provides cushion. It protects the baby in the placenta. And then the umbilical cord will form has the 2 umbilical arteries coming in and 1 umbilical vein going out. We'll talk a bit more about the blood supply coming along in the future. So again, here's your kind of close-up views. Week 4, 5, 6, 7. No, you're right. They're really not very beautiful things. But are you comfortable this starting to look like a person? You can pick out a head, you can pick out a spine, you can pick out legs and arms and eyes and ears and mouth. You know? And again, up at this stage is where we already got the heart beating, which is craziness to me, that it happens that fast. Okay, I think that we're going to stop there for today. I do have one more picture. Let me just show that to you quick. There's some more of these pictures that are in your textbook that I'll put up here for you just so you can see. This is actual looking. I think this is about 8 weeks, maybe a little bit longer than that. Maybe your textbook says exactly where it is. This is certainly much more developed. This would be probably about 14.
How big is that?
Very small. It's tough because they have, so this is like 10 millimeters. You're talking about very small. These are very small little things, right? And this is the different weeks from 13 all the way up to 23. Right, yeah, no, absolutely. Yes? No, a miscarriage can be any time through that process. Normally they say if you make it through the first trimester, the first 3 months, then you're pretty cool.